Well, welcome to The Catholic Reason, a radio production of St. Michael Catholic Radio based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, where we think through various claims made by the Catholic Church concerning issues of faith, morality, and culture, and provide reasons behind those claims. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard, staff apologist and speaker for Catholic Answers at Catholic.com, and a member of the Chancery Evangelization team here at the Diocese of Tulsa in eastern Oklahoma. The Catholic Reason airs locally here in Tulsa every Thursday from 4 to 5 p.m. on St. Michael Catholic Radio, 94.9 and 102.9, and across the entire Oklahoma Catholic Radio network of 15 stations, including 97.3 FM in Oklahoma City, 100.9 in Edmond, and 88.3 FM in Lawton. But you may be listening at a different time on your own local Catholic station outside Oklahoma, since the Catholic Reason is aired on other Catholic stations throughout the country. Regardless of where you are, welcome and thanks for joining me today. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform that you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. That's the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast. And you can also access the archived episodes at my website, karlobroussard.com, under both the audio and video tab. In today's episode, we're going to give a sketch, and I emphasize a sketch because there's a lot more to it than what I'm going to give you today, but a sketch of a general defense of the historical reliability of the Gospels. The historical reliability of the Gospels is essential to Christianity, or at least belief in Christianity. If the historical records of Jesus' life are not trustworthy as accounts of things that actually happened, there would be little reason to believe that Christianity is true. Sure, there would be the testimony of oral tradition, but skeptics aren't privy to such testimony. So promotion of the Christian faith in our secular world rises or falls with its historical validity. Skeptics want to view the historical records of Jesus' life as untrustworthy. For example, the late Christopher Hitchens opined in his book, God is Not Great, on page 142, the New Testament is itself a highly dubious source. The late American journalist H.L. Mencken, and his treatise on the gods on page 175 referred to the New Testament as a helter-skelter accumulation of more or less discordant documents. This view, which continues among skeptics today, constitutes a major obstacle to encountering the truth of Jesus. Therefore, it's imperative that we try and help folks overcome this obstacle. The strategies that we're going to employ can be summarized in an acronym that I got from scholars Craig Blomberg and Scott Sullivan, and that acronym is AID. A stands for aid. A stands for able. The gospel writers were able to write reliable history. I stands for intention. The gospel writers intended to write reliable history. And D stands for did. The gospel writers did write reliable history. Now, note that everything I say here in today's episode is written in written form in my book, Prepare the Way, Overcoming Obstacles to God, the Gospel, and the Church. And you can get that at shop.catholic.com. That was the first book that I published through Catholic Answers Press. Also, it's important to note that these three strategies that I'm going to share with you to show that the gospel writers were able to write reliable history, intended to write reliable history, did write reliable history, they provide an introduction or a sketch, as I emphasized earlier, as how we can at least begin to defend the historical reliability of the Gospels. As I've mentioned already, there's a lot more that can be said for each of the three strategies that I will share with you today. But for our purposes, we're simply offering a sketch to at least introduce you, the listener, or even the viewer on YouTube here, if you're watching on YouTube, that this is a sketch of how we would go about defending the historical reliability of the Gospels, or at least one way to do it. All right, so let's get started with the first strategy. Show that the Gospel writers were able to write reliable history. Remember the acronym AID, A-I-D. A stands for able to write reliable history. Now, there are three reasons to believe that the Gospel writers were able to write reliable history, or at least we can give three reasons for our purposes here. There are more, but I'll focus on three that we can give. First, they were either eyewitnesses of the events that they're reporting on, as in the case of Matthew and John, or close associates of eyewitnesses, as in the cases of Mark and Luke. According to the 4th century historian Eusebius of Caesarea in his church history in 339-15, Mark was a disciple of Peter. We know from Philemon 23 through 24, Colossians 4, 10 through 11 and 14, and 2 Timothy 4, 1, Luke was a companion of Paul. So each of these guys had close collaboration with the apostles who were eyewitnesses of the events that they're reporting on. Now, this kind of testimony, both eyewitnesses and even close associates of eyewitnesses, is golden for historiographical research. When you have eyewitness accounts, that provides for us strong likelihood, strong probability that the events that are being reported on are historically reliable, and even close associates of eyewitnesses. Even though you don't have a person who is an eyewitness himself, if he can consult eyewitness testimony, that's almost just as good as having the eyewitness testimony, because you're simply just recording what the eyewitnesses are testifying to. Now, if someone were to doubt the traditional authorship of the Gospels, that Matthew and John, for example, actually wrote the Gospels attributed to them, then we can just point out that all the ancient manuscripts have the traditional names ascribed to them. And this is important because notice the claim here, one reason to trust, one reason to think that the Gospel writers were able to write reliable history is that they were eyewitnesses, or you had close associates, consultants of eyewitness testimony. So the counter here is, well, we don't really know whether these Gospel writers were actually eyewitnesses. You're relying on Matthew and John to be eyewitnesses, but, we don't really know the traditional authorship of those Gospels. And so it's important to respond to that counter. And as I mentioned, all of the traditional manuscripts that we have, indeed, they are copies of the autographs, but that manuscript tradition is very reliable. That's content for another episode. But given that the traditional manuscripts, all of them have the traditional names ascribed to the Gospel writers, we can reasonably conclude that that's tracking history, that these Gospels were written by the men whose names are ascribed to them. Now, for more details on this, I recommend you check out Dr. Brant Petree's book, The Case for Jesus, The Biblical and Historical Evidence for Christ. On page 16, he deals with this particular counter-argument concerning the traditional authorship of the Gospels. Furthermore, think about this. It would have made no sense to have misrepresented the authorship of at least 3 of those Gospels, since Matthew was a despised tax collector and Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses. The point here is that if, early Christians did not know who these Gospels were written by, and they're just slapping names on them to ascribe some sort of credibility to them, well then putting Matthew, Mark, and Luke would have been at cross purposes, would be contrary to the purpose of trying to make up names for these Gospels, because nobody's going to pay any attention to Gospels written by non-eyewitnesses like Mark and Luke, or written by Matthew, a tax collector. If you're just slapping names, why not put Peter on these Gospels? Why not put James or Nathaniel or one of the 12 apostles who were eyewitnesses? Why put Mark and Luke when you had other options such as eyewitnesses? Why put Matthew, who was despised as a tax collector, rather than put somebody else that would have been more receptive, that someone else whom people would have been more receptive to, especially of the Jewish audience. So that we have the names of Matthew, Mark, and Luke ascribed to these Gospels is a strong indication that these were the men who wrote them. It's factual. All right, so that's our first reason why the Gospel writers would have been able to write reliable history. Namely, they were eyewitnesses or close associates of eyewitnesses. And so the information would have been reasonably accurate. A second reason is that the Gospels were written in close temporal proximity to the events recorded. All historians agree that the closer the written record of an event, the closer the written records of an event are to the event, the better. I'm going to repeat that. The closer the written records of an event are to the event, the better. The less time there is between the records of the events and the events themselves, the better the writer would have been able to remember what happened. That's pretty commonsensical. Also, perhaps even more importantly, proximity, temporal proximity, decreases the chance of legendary influences altering the core facts. So how close in time was gospel authorship to the events that they record? Well, that's a good question. And that's a question that we're going to have to wait and answer on the other side of the break. So my friends, I'm coming up to my first break. Please stay tuned. More to come on the other side. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back to The Catholic Reason. In today's episode, we are looking at the question of whether the Gospels are trustworthy. And in our first segment, I was teeing up 3 strategies that we can employ to try and defend the historical trustworthiness of the Gospels, at least in an introductory manner, giving a sketch of how we would go about defending the historical reliability of the Gospels. And I shared with you the acronym AID, A-I-D. A, they were able to write reliable history. I, intended to write reliable history. D, did write reliable history. In our first segment, we started to dive into their ability. One reason that we gave for that was that the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses or close associates to eyewitnesses, Matthew and John being eyewitnesses, Mark and Luke being close associates of eyewitnesses, Mark being an associate of Peter, Luke being a companion of Paul, and of course Luke telling us that he consulted eyewitness testimony in his prologue. So that was one reason. Now, a second reason that I began to articulate was that the Gospels were written in close temporal proximity to the events that they're reporting on. And we mentioned how the closer a report is to the event that it's reporting on, the better. The better able the author is going to be able to remember the material accurately and convey it accurately. And also it precludes legendary developments. So we left off with the question, well, how close in time was gospel authorship to the events the Gospels record? Well, we could start with Matthew and Mark, which could not have been written any later than AD 68. The early Christian writer Irenaeus, in his work against heresies in Book 3, and I think Book 3, Chapter 1, he makes clear that Matthew wrote his gospel while Peter and Paul were still alive. And Eusebius confirms this in his church history in Book 5. Eusebius of Caesarea, 4th century church historian, he affirms that Peter and Paul died during Nero's persecution, which lasted from AD 64 to AD 68. Now, most scholars agree that Mark wrote his gospel before Matthew, therefore placing it prior to AD 68 as well. So we know that Matthew and Mark could not have written any later than AD 68. Now, there is evidence that suggests Matthew and Mark may have written their gospels even earlier, before AD 62. And here's how the reasoning goes. Luke wrote the Acts of the Apostles after he wrote his gospel, and that's clear. And he wrote his gospel after Matthew and Mark's gospel. And you can check out Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 in his prologue, where he says he consulted eyewitness testimony. He and others had written down things that Jesus did. Now, for the dating, consider in Acts 28, 16 through 31, Luke describes how he was with Paul while Paul was under his 2-year house arrest in Rome, which many scholars date to around AD 60, putting the composition of the Acts of the Apostles at AD 62. Craig Blomberg explains this in his contributing chapter, Where Do We Start Studying Jesus, in the book Jesus Under Fire on page 29. Craig Blomberg talks about this dating. Now, some even push Paul's imprisonment back 2 years, thus dating the Acts of the Apostles to around the year AD 60. My colleague and friend at Catholic Answer, Jimmy Akin, makes this claim in his book, Daily Defense, on day 79. So we have the Acts of the Apostles being written either AD 62 or even earlier, AD 60. Now, upon finishing the chapter of Acts 28 and consequently the book, you'll notice an abrupt ending by Luke. Luke doesn't give any information as to what happened after Paul's appeal to Caesar while he was under house arrest. Nothing on Caesar's response or even Paul's death, which took place a few years later. It seems that Luke, who saw it fit to record the martyrdom of Stephen in Acts chapter 7, and even James the Greater in Acts 12:2, it seems he would have written about Paul's martyrdom, especially after devoting 10 chapters to the events leading up to and including Paul's arrest and trials. But why doesn't Luke record Paul's martyrdom? Well, the likely answer is that Luke was writing at a time of Paul's house arrest and did not continue afterward. He stopped writing while Paul was under house arrest. And if this is true, we must date the Acts of the Apostles no later than AD 62, which dates Luke's gospel to earlier than AD 62, probably AD 61 or 60, and the Gospels of Matthew and Mark earlier still, right at the end of the 50s or right at AD 60. This means that eyewitnesses surely would still have been alive at the time those synoptic gospels were composed, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, thus giving the gospel writers reliable sources to consult with and restricting legendary developments. Because it's in living memory and eyewitnesses are still around. They can oversee the reports to make sure that the facts are not being fudged and no legends are being included that would be incompatible with the real historical events. So it's reasonable to conclude that the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written no more than 35 years after the events they record, and likely even within 30 years. Now, compare this with other ancient texts that are considered reliable according to historians. Take, for example, the biographies of Alexander the Great. New Testament scholar Craig Blomberg writes this, and this is in his this is in his book, Historical Reliability of the New Testament, on page 18. He writes this: the oldest existing biographies of Alexander are by Diodorus in the 1st century BC, Quintus Curtius in the 1st century AD, and Plutarch and Arrian, the two best works who wrote in the early 2nd century AD, more than 4 centuries after Alexander's death. He goes on, they in turn refer to various early written sources, sometimes named, on which they relied, but none of these still exist, and we know nothing else about them. Yet, via the standard canons of research, and especially because Arrian regularly names eyewitness sources, historians of ancient Greece can assemble a detailed summary of Alexander's life, about which they remain reasonably confident. World civilization textbooks typically rely on these summaries without hesitation. Again, that's a quote from Blomberg, Historical Reliability of the New Testament, on page 18. Similarly, Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha's biography, is also roughly 400 years removed from the events they record. The 6 sources for the life of Caesar Augustus range from 90 to 200 years after the events they record. We have a funerary inscription that's nearly 4,000 words in length. Secondly, Plutarch, who wrote around 90 years after Augustus's death, and 4 others writing 100 to 200 years after his death. So the question becomes, which would be more reasonable to trust? The Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, which are no more than 35 years removed from the events they record, and probably even within 30 years, and even John's Gospel, which is roughly 60 years removed. So compare that time gap. Is it more reasonable to trust those sources with that time gap between the events and the reports of the events? Or is it more reasonable to trust the biographies of Alexander the Great, Siddhartha Gautama the Buddha, and even the life of Caesar Augustus? I think the answer is clear. A 35 or even a 60-year time gap is far more preferable than a 400-year time gap or a 100-year time gap, 200-year time gap when evaluating the historical reliability of ancient documents. So again, when we compare the temporal proximity of the Synoptic Gospels and even John's Gospel to the events that they're reporting on, there is no comparison compared to other ancient documents reporting on ancient events. The temporal proximity of the Gospels are very much closer to the events they're reporting on than all other ancient documents. So if historians are going to look to these other ancient documents with credibility, reporting on these ancient events, then they must look to the Gospels, in the Synoptics and John, with credibility concerning the events that they're reporting on. Okay, so we've given 2 reasons for the gospel writers being able to write reliable history. They're written by eyewitnesses and close associates of eyewitnesses. They're written in close temporal proximity to the events that they're recording. Now we can finally come to a third reason, right? And it's prompted by a skeptic thinking that, well, maybe even 30 years, 35 or even 30 years is still too long to accurately remember Jesus' words and actions, especially since many of us can't even remember what we ate for lunch last week. So for those who might be thinking as such, consider the following points. The apostles were students of Jesus who lived with him for 3 years, day in, day out, 24/7, receiving daily instruction. They didn't receive just a fly-by lecture in an auditorium one time and then go home and go about their merry way. The apostles, secondly, would have frequently rehearsed Jesus' teaching in their own teaching and preaching before writing them down. And you can check out Matthew 10, 1 through 23 for that. And thus, it would have solidified those teachings in their memory, having to teach them their own. So not only spending time with Jesus 24/7 for 3 years and receiving those teachings frequently, but they also rehearsed those teachings and teaching them to others. And as anybody knows, when you have to teach the information, that's when you really learn the information. And whenever you teach the information is sealed and embedded within one's memory. So more to come, folks. I'm coming up on my second break. I'm going to have to hit the pause button. More to come on this issue on the other side. I'm Dr. Karlo Broussard. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to The Catholic Reason. We are looking at the historical trustworthiness of the Gospels, answering the question, can we trust them? And I'm answering yes, we can, and providing some reasons why we can answer in the affirmative. So far, we've been looking at reasons why the gospel writers would have been able to write reliable history. We said they were eyewitnesses, close associates to eyewitnesses. They were written in close temporal proximity to the events they're reporting on compared to other ancient documents. And then before the break, I started looking at some other reasons why the apostles would have been able to write reliable history. They were students of Jesus, living with him day in and day out, 24/7 for 3 years, receiving that daily instruction, thereby cementing the teachings in their memory, rather than just like receiving a flyby lecture in an auditorium and then going about your merry way. Secondly, the apostles would have frequently rehearsed Jesus' teaching by going out and teaching and preaching and sharing that teaching with others, as Matthew tells us they did in chapter 10. And that would have solidified the teachings in their memory. Thirdly, the apostles lived in a cultural milieu where the ability to memorize and retain large amounts of information was highly prized and even a developed skill. So as New Testament scholar Craig Keener points out in his Gospel Truth, the historical reliability of the Gospels in the book Come Let Us Reason, ancient Greeks memorized epics from Homer. Keener also references how Seneca the elder could repeat 2,000 names in exactly the sequence in which he had just heard them, and the Jews memorized large portions of the Old Testament. So it was a cultural milieu in which amounts of information, memorizing and retaining amounts of information was highly prized. Also, the gospel writers had oral sources that actually predate the final written form. So it's not like the gospel writers are just waking up one day 35 years later and say, okay, I'm going to write down what I remember Jesus said and did. No, they had oral sources that they're pulling from that predates the written form and thus putting the information closer to the events that's being reported on. Resources for this claim are Craig Blomberg's essay in the book Jesus Under Fire. I recommend you check that out. Stevenson Brooks' book Matthew's Community, the evidence of his special sayings material, and Stephen Ferris's The Hymns of Luke's Infancy Narratives. Those would be some resources for the predating of the oral sources predating the Gospels. Also, many scholars have pointed out that it's very likely the apostles would have made written notes while traveling with Jesus. You know, the Chosen captures this nicely with Matthew and John taking notes, shorthand notes of their rabbi teaching. Scholars point out that's historically accurate, that very possibly would have happened and probably did happen with the apostles and Jesus. And finally, there was leadership present to ensure faithful transmission of the information. Now, perhaps at this point, our skeptic friend may concede that the gospel writers were at least able to record events accurately, given the reasons that we've shared so far. But the question becomes, was it their intention to write reliable history? For all we know, they could have been intending to write folklore. So this brings us to strategy 2. Show that the gospel writers intended to write reliable history. Not only were they able, but they actually intended to do so. And there are 3 reasons to think the gospel writers intended to write reliable history. The first is that the gospel writers record details that are not commonly found in myths and legends. So, for example, the gospels include actual historical events, the Passover, say, or the Feast of Tabernacles. They record historical individuals with high-ranking positions. They're not just name-dropping, they're name-dropping high-ranking officials. Pontius Pilate, Caiaphas the high priest, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar. These are all checkable names, right? There's not just some Joe Schmo that nobody knows about. And that indicates that these gospel writers were intending to write reliable history, intending to write history and facts, not folklore or legendary developments. These sorts of details are not the sort of details you would include if you're writing folklore. Legends or myths usually are not concerned with real-life details, like in the case of the Gospels. In this case, the events and names in the Gospels would have been easily subject to verification during the first century. And so these facts suggest that the Gospel authors meant to root their narratives in history. It's not just a fairy tale, legend, or folklore. A second reason is that at least 2 gospel writers explicitly express their intention to write reliable history. So not only do they have details subject to verification in the first century, but they expressly say, hey, we're writing history here. So for example, John says in John 19:35, he who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells you the truth, that you may also believe. So John's just saying, I have witnessed this, and I'm telling you what I saw. Luke also makes his historical intention clear in the prologue to his gospel. In verses 1 through 4 of Luke 1, he writes this: "Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things which have been accomplished among us," indicating that he's writing his gospel after some have already written theirs, probably Mark and Matthew, "just as they delivered to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the truth concerning the things of which you have been informed." Now, interestingly, Dr. Brant Petrie, in his book, The Case for Jesus, notes that Luke's prologue here is similar to other historical prologues written by Greco-Roman authors such as Herodotus, Thucydides, and Josephus, thereby giving further evidence for the intention to write history. So I recommend you check out Petrie there on that issue. Furthermore, there are 3 clues that suggest Luke's historical intent. The first is Luke's usage of diocesan, the Greek word for narrative. Joseph Fitzmyer, in Volume 1 of his The Gospel According to Luke, Greco-Roman authors use this word to specify, as Fitzmyer puts it, the writing of history. A second clue is Luke's emphasis on the eyewitnesses. Luke knows that by passing his narrative on eyewitnesses, from eyewitnesses, he makes it possible for his readers to corroborate his testimony about Jesus, right? So they can go and they can ask the eyewitnesses about what Luke is reporting on to verify or even falsify the facts. So that indicates he's intending to write reliable history. And finally, Luke identifies the purpose of his gospel as to give, quote unquote, the truth about what has been taught. Interestingly, Luke uses the Greek word asphalein there, which is a word he uses elsewhere for, quote unquote, the facts in Acts chapter 21, verse 34. So Luke is intending to give us facts in his gospel. So I think we can ask an important question here. Why would Luke use a word that means writing history, emphasize eyewitnesses, and identify his purpose in presenting the facts if he were just intending to write folklore? That doesn't make sense, right? Those details are defeaters of the folklore or legend hypothesis. These details give strong indication Luke is trying to write reliable history. I think, as I said, the reasonable answer is that Luke wouldn't be using these details if he were just writing folklore. Luke's intention was to write a factual narrative, not a mythical one. Now, the third reason for thinking that these gospel writers intended to write reliable history is that there are clear formal similarities between the Gospels and ancient historical biographies of the era, such as the life of Josephus, AD 100, the lives of the Caesars, written by Roman historian Suetonius in AD 120. The following examples that I'm going to give you are all given in Dr. Petrie's book, The Case for Jesus, on pages 70 through 72. For example, the Gospel's tripartite focus on Jesus' birth, public life, and death is also an essential part of ancient biographies. So that's a parallel. Another parallel can be seen in Matthew and Luke, who begin their biographies with Jesus' ancestry. You can check that out in Matthew chapter 1, verses 1 through 16, and Luke chapter 3, verses 23 through 38. Just as the phrase, once upon a time, signifies a fairy tale, and Paul to the Church of Rome signifies a letter, so genealogy signifies an ancient biography. For example, Josephus' autobiography and Lucian's biography of Demonax both begin by listing the subject's ancestry. Scholars point to a third parallel as well between the Gospels and ancient biographies, namely the flexibility authors take with arranging material topically or thematically, not necessarily chronologically. This was something ancient authors did. So, for example, Suetonius writes about Caesar Augustus, quote, not in chronological order, but by categories, close quote. And so that's something that's part and parcel of the way ancients wrote, organizing material thematically or categorically, according to categories, not necessarily chronologically. And the gospel writers did that. This is actually similar to what the early Christian writer Papias says of Mark. And this is preserved in Eusebius's church history, where Papias says, Mark wrote everything he remembered, though not in order, of the things either said or done by Christ. So there you have Papias confirming that this was part of ancient practice, organizing things thematically rather than chronologically. And finally, the Gospels parallel ancient biographies in that they do not intend to tell the reader everything about the person. They actually leave things out. As John says in John 21:25, there are also many other things which Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And this is very similar to what the Greek historian Plutarch says in his biography of Alexander the Great. But I'll have to get to that on the other side of the break. Stay tuned. You're listening to The Catholic Reason. Well, welcome back, my friends, to our last and final segment of today's episode of The Catholic Reason. In our last segment before the break, we were looking at formal similarities between the Gospels and ancient historical biographies, presenting that as a reason to think that the Gospel writers were intending to write reliable history. And before the break, I was talking about how the Gospels parallel ancient biographies. One of the formal similarities or parallels is that the Gospel writers do not intend to tell the reader everything about the person, something that we find in other biographies. John tells us this about Jesus in John 21:25. And this is very similar to what the Greek historian Plutarch says in his biography of Alexander the Great, where he writes, multitude of deeds is so great that I shall make no other preface than to entreat my readers, in case I do not tell of all the famous actions of these men, nor even speak exhaustively at all in each particular case. Again, that's Plutarch on Alexander the Great. So it's very similar to what John says about Jesus. Lucian is another example. He writes in the life of Demonax, these are very few things out of many which I might have mentioned, but they will suffice to give my readers a notion of the sort of man Demonax was. So yet again, we have these ancient biographies not intentionally withholding some information and not telling everything about that person. And John does that very same thing, thereby giving us yet another reason to think that the gospel writers were intending to write reliable history because of these parallels between the gospels and ancient historical biographies. So when the gospel writers' intention to write history is coupled with the fact that they were able to write history, well, then one has a good reason to approach the Gospels with a sense of trust. But there is yet a third strategy that we can employ, and that is to show that the Gospel writers did write reliable history. And of course, it provides us a cumulative case. Once you combine the factual writing of history, which we can corroborate with their intention to write history and their ability to write reliable history, well, then we have a pretty strong case. Now, there are three ways we can show that the gospel writers actually did write reliable history. First, there are critical sayings and events in Jesus' life that meet the criteria that historians use to determine the historicity of a saying or an event. There are many of these criteria, but the most popular are, say, multiple attestation, where you have more than one independent source verifying something. The embarrassment criterion, and that's, of course, refers to details that might seem to contradict the writer's purpose. And coherence, that is to say, one detail fits with other known details that are indeed historical. So take, for example, Jesus' death. The four Gospels, Paul's epistles, the writings of the early church fathers, the first century Jewish historian Josephus and his work, The Antiquities, and the first and second century Roman historian Tacitus and his work, The Annals, attest to Jesus' death, thus satisfying the criterion of multiple attestation. Furthermore, Jesus' crucifixion coheres, and by the way, those multiple attestations do not just confirm Jesus' death, but Jesus' death by crucifixion. Furthermore, Jesus' crucifixion coheres with other details we know about Jesus' life. So, for example, the Gospels detail Jesus' claims to be God. And in the eyes of first century Jews, such a claim is punishable by death. Therefore, Jesus' death coheres with his historical claims to be divine. And since Jesus' death coheres with his claims to be God, it's most likely his death is a historical fact. The criterion of embarrassment is found on multiple occasions, but perhaps the most clear is the gospel writer's account of women witnessing the resurrection, being the first to witness the resurrection. And as many know, the testimony of women in first century Judaism was not taken seriously. Josephus would talk about how we can't do that given the levity of their sex. They don't take things seriously, right? Given such a cultural milieu, why would the gospel writers make women the first witnesses of the resurrection unless it was true? So that's a strong indication they're not making this stuff up. These are just a few of the criteria, but there are many more details that meet the historiographical criteria and thus indicate the historical accuracy of the gospel writers. So this is one approach to show that the gospel writers did in fact write reliable history. I just gave the example of Jesus' death by crucifixion. And also too, the early Christian claim that Christians saw Jesus. Given the fact that women were the first witnesses, that strongly indicates that's a historical fact. They claim to have seen Jesus. For more details that meet these sort of criteria, I would recommend Volume 2 of John P. Meyer's book, A Marginal Jew, Rethinking the Historical Jesus. Now, a second way you can show that the gospel writers did, in fact, write reliable history is by listing archaeological evidence that confirms gospel details. Scholars have written books on this stuff. I'm just going to share with you a few items here. Consider, for example, the 19th century discovery of the Pool of Bethesda mentioned in John chapter 5. You have the 1961 discovery in Caesarea of an inscription with Pontius Pilate's name. The 1961 discovery in Caesarea Maritima of a 3rd century mosaic that had the name Nazareth in it, the first known ancient non-biblical reference. We have coins with references to the names of the Herodian dynasty, Herod the king, Herod the Tetrarch of Galilee, the one who killed John the Baptist, Herod Agrippa I, the one who killed James, son of Zebedee, and Herod Agrippa II, before whom Paul testified. We have the 1990 ossuary discovered that had the Aramaic words Joseph, son of Caiaphas, inscribed on it. And then that, of course, would confirm the existence of Caiaphas, right? You have archaeological evidence confirming that gospel report, or at least that gospel detail. And then, of course, you have the 1960 ossuary discovered near Jerusalem that contained the bones of a first century man who had been crucified. Details of where you have the nails still stuck in the heel bone. And this confirms the gospel narratives of Jesus' crucifixion. This is not Jesus' heel bone, okay? But a first century heel bone of someone who was crucified corroborates what the gospels are telling us about Jesus being crucified. Okay, now finally, we know that the gospel writers did in fact write history because many gospel details are confirmed by ancient non-Christian sources, not only by archaeological evidence, but these other non-Christian sources as well. For example, the first century Jewish historian Josephus mentions in his Antiquities of the Jews, Caiaphas the high priest, Annas the high priest, Pontius Pilate, King Herod and his descendants, John the Baptist being killed by Herod, James, the quote-unquote brother of Jesus, and Josephus even refers to Jesus as a quote-unquote wise man, a doer of startling deeds, and a figure who was condemned to death by Pontius Pilate. That's several gospel details that are confirmed here by Josephus. And notice that Josephus refers to Jesus as a wise man, indicating that's accurate. That's coming from Josephus's mouth, not a Christian interpolation, because Christians wouldn't have been just referring to Jesus as a wise man. Notice Josephus says a doer of startling deeds. He doesn't affirm their miracles. He just said he'd done some pretty cool stuff, right? And that's important as well. And then, of course, confirming that he's died under Pontius Pilate. In his work, The Annals, the first century Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus refers to the group of people called Christians and describes their leader as Christus, the founder of the name, who was put to death by Pontius Pilate, procurator of Judea, in the reign of Tiberius. And this is even affirmed by New Testament agnostic Bart Ehrman. In reference to Tacitus's report, he says, his report confirms what we know from other sources, that Jesus was executed by order of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, sometime during Tiberius's reign. That's in Ehrman's book, The New Testament, a historical introduction to early Christian writings. So Ehrman confirms that Tacitus's report and comment on Jesus is historical. So you got Josephus, you got Tacitus, and of course we also have Lucian of Samosata, the Greek satirist, from 120 to 192 AD. He writes this: the Christians, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. So it is a little bit later than Tacitus, but nevertheless, still within the mid-2nd century, writing on the historicity of Jesus, and in particular, his crucifixion. So there we have 3 non-Christian 1st and 2nd century sources confirming certain gospel details, which provides for us a disposition to have a general trust in the gospel. So in light of the historiographical criteria, the archaeological evidence, and the corroboration of gospel details in ancient non-Christian sources, it's reasonable to conclude that the gospel writers were not only able to write reliable history, and indeed meant to do so, but they in fact did write a trustworthy record of the life of Jesus. Well, my friends, that's all the time we have for this week's episode of The Catholic Reason. My claim today is that the Gospels are indeed historically trustworthy. And the sketch for a general defense is that the Gospel writers were able to write reliable history. That's the A in the acronym. They intended to write reliable history, I, and they did write reliable history, D. So you got an acronym, AID, in order to help you remember these 3 strategies. Now, as I mentioned, there's much more to be said concerning the historical reliability of the Gospels, but at least the material that I've shared here today can serve as an introduction, or at least a sketch, to the topic of defending the historical reliability of the Gospels. And of course, there's a lot more to come in future episodes. Friends, thanks for listening to The Catholic Reason, again, a production of St. Michael Catholic Radio, based here in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Remember, you can download the show through whichever podcast platform you use by subscribing to the Eastern Oklahoma Catholic Podcast, and you can also access the episodes at my website, KarloBroussard.com, under the audio tab. I invite you to join me again next week. Tell a friend, and I'll talk to you then. God bless.